Good evening and welcome to our first event for the second act of General Rehearsal. It's a great pleasure to introduce you to you Armen Avanesyan, a philosopher based in Berlin, who in the past few years has been producing quite a number of books and teaching in a number of positions, including the Free University in Berlin for a permanent position, and he still is visiting fellow in a number of universities, including Columbia and Yale University in the US. Armen has developed a series of concepts revolving around the notion of speculation and future projections and fiction, which he has articulated in a number of books, but also in a way of experimenting with theory that is pretty unconventional. For example, he's been running a theory program at the Volksbühne in Berlin, where theory is put on stage rather than performed with like a person speaking and other people just listening. Before we start, I want to just briefly introduce the format of this evening. Armen and I wanted to talk about institutions, and this is because I don't know how many of you have seen the libretto and the exhibition, but one of the scene, number 9, in the exhibition looks at one particular fiction, which is one particular fiction and question, which is what cultural institution do we need today? As artistic director of V-A-C, together with the team, we have spent a number of months, and we will continue spending a number of months trying to imagine what the institution of the future should look like. We constantly debate this, and we are in the process of designing as we speak. To a certain extent, general rehearsal for us is also a rehearsal for a possible institution from the future. So this exhibition is determined by our projections that we are putting towards the future. So in that sense, it's very similar to the kind of theoretical proposition that Armen puts forward. And so we decided to have a quick discussion, a quick conversation and question and answer between him and myself for maybe 15-20 minutes. And then we would like to open it to the public, to every one of you, to have a really open forum for people to ask questions or to make statements, put forward positions. And this is one of the experiments and values that, as V-A-C, we would like to start getting familiar with. How do we involve the public in the setting up and design of an institution? This is one of our ambitions, so somehow even this forum is a rehearsal. It's an experiment, at least from my very selfish point of view. We are sitting here tonight on a work of art called Demos by the Greek artist Andreasa Ангелидакиса, who originally did a similar version of this work for Documenta, and it was called Parliament of Bodies. This is designed to fit inside this neoclassical ballroom what may be more in fiction than in reality a Greek demos, a Greek parliament would have been. A room where everyone is sitting looking at each other, so there is no separation between an audience and performers. So in that sense, this is why we set it up like this. The work also fragments and can be set up in many other ways. Some of you must have seen it in previous events. But here is what we would like to do tonight and try to get to a meaningful open discussion. I would like to start by asking Armen his own question. What institutions do we need now and in the future?
First of all, thanks really a lot for the invitation. It's not just a pleasure and an honor, it's also interesting coming back to an institution. I've been here before, like 1.5 years or so in this room actually. And before I answer, maybe I approach the question in a different way. It was interesting. I was here like 3 days before, and there was a lot of things going on, and didn't recognize the room. First of all, I was here on a panel, actually sitting exactly where I was sitting 1.5 years ago or so. And only today, when the room was somehow empty and cleaned up, I realized, oh, I've been here before. But I was just been here for 10 seconds, and then I came back like 10 minutes ago, and I realized, yeah, definitely I was here before. Because what institutions do is, I have to quote myself in the text, quoting a sociologist, saying institutions are social regulations of patterns of behavior regulated by rewards and sanction. You can forget the complicated definition immediately, but what it says, you can read it again at home. But what it says is that institutions are not just built structures, like academies or art museums, but they are also informal things. Marriage is an institution, or trade unions are institution, or the market is an institution. And they shape our behavior. And they do it via values and norms that reward us with something, that promise us something, or they threaten us with sanctions. So when I came in, I realized that even though this is a very different setup, it's a democratic setup, you know, different than the panel that was here two years ago, where it was clear who is talking and who's the audience. But even though the setting is different, everyone behaved in the way one behaves in these kind of institutions for these kind of occasions, and that is, you take the role of the passive audience, and you left the front row, you know, to the speakers. And this is what institutions do, right? And then there's often a complaint about institutions that they are hierarchical. But when institutions, for example, try to build a different setup, the audience, the critical audience, comes in and puts the speaker again in this kind of role of the authority. So sorry for this long kind of pre-answer before I come to something trying to answer, but I wanted to show you like a bit what's at stake and what we need to have in our mind when we talk about what kind of institutions do we need. Because we have the institutions always already like in our head, and the structure really how we sit down.
I propose that we ask Karen and Anya to move here, and we move there. So
yeah,
we'll
I wanted to
happens.
go somewhere here and immediately just change this.
Yeah? Let's do it, no?
So it's our idea. It should have come from you, but it's too late now. Can I swap with you? Okay, wonderful. Very
so now we are on two opposing benches, like in the
democracy. Democracy is like
at work.
Yeah. So what kind of institutions do we need?
I don't really know what kind of institutions do we need, because I believe that we've established this kind of hierarchy for a very long time, and it's going to be very difficult to come up with a new idea of how we perceive institutions.
Okay, but like, is it that we? Who's the we you're talking about? You know, I mean, the we is everywhere. We establish the institutions, and we will. But we are the institutions, right?
Surely we are the institutions. Again, we are, because we've established a system of nations and precariat. I don't know.
Precariat.
Yeah, and it all made sense for some reason to us for a very long time, and after postmodernism, and it started to break up. In my mind.
I completely agree. That's why the show is called like whatever, from the future. I think we have to think not just about the future, but we have to think from the future. I really liked your answer. It was a good idea to sit down here. Because there's two elements that I think we have to put together. One is the institutions, because we have what you call postmodernism. I would say we have behind us like several decades of criticizing institutions. I mean, there's a lot of reasons one should criticize institutions, but I think today, given the general political situation and cultural situation, we need these institutions, and these institutions are much stronger than they actually think. And the question is like, how can we, and I'm putting the question back maybe to Francesco, like, what kind of institution are you trying to set up, and how?
There's been a lot of conversation with the team, and many of them are here, so I ask them to join later on in the conversation. And I would say that there are a number of values or directions that we identified. One is ability to constantly change and adapt to the environment. So an institution of the future is not one that is designed perfectly and then stays like that, but it's one who is equipped to respond to feedback from the audience, to feedback from the artist, to all sorts of environmental feedback, for example. So change is definitely, I would say, the most important value and the most important aspiration and adaptability. Responsiveness is another one, the idea that an institution is, in the digital age, cannot work like a television with a broadcasting ability, like we, curators, film experts, theater directors, have the knowledge, and we will tell you what is interesting in art and theater and music. But on the contrary, in the digital age, the idea that there's a sort of two-way street in the production of knowledge and in the diffusion and distribution of knowledge is something that institutions, cultural institutions, haven't learned yet. And then there's the idea of being an open forum and involving the audience in owning and changing how the institution behaves. So these are pretty much the values that we've been discussing that then break down in a number of aspirations and dreams.
What I find exciting about I mean, I'm not saying this out of politeness because I was invited by the V-A-C, but I was today, I can only invite you to go across the bridge at this church that I only know as Pussy Riot Church. I don't know how it's called.
It's the Patriarchy Bridge, the cathedral, the bridge in front of the cathedral.
If you cross the bridge, then you see the building site of the V-A-C. And I was there with someone from the institution, with Greta, and she said something really interesting, namely that we witness a kind of technological and political and maybe also cultural change that is so quick that we cannot keep up. So the main problem is that the institutions, even if they try to reform themselves, they cannot keep up with the pace of change. Which made me think that maybe there's a wrong way of approaching the whole problem, namely of trying to be, now I use a bit my terminology, we're in a contemporary culture. We try to be as much in the present as possible. We try to be contemporary, as the word says. I mean, contemporary art is not by chance called contemporary art instead of modern art or avant-garde. They all had a future in front of themselves. Contemporary art is obsessed with the present, and I think it stands really symbolic for our society, and something obviously doesn't work. So I liked what you said, but I'm really interested, like, I should give away the microphone. That's better than good intentions. I just give it away. So I'm really interested, what is an institution that is not trying to be contemporary and relevant for the now, but that will be open to the future, that lets somehow the future in, and whatever is going to happen. But it's very hard for us to think about it because somehow we are trained in this kind of like 20th century ideology that the institution is something that is fixed and that is stable, and it's the opposite of what we are. No, we always try to liberate ourselves from from the institution. Every philosopher does not want to be an academic because he's a revolutionary, and every artist does not want to be, I don't know what, but actually he's an anarchist. And I think this ideology is not very helpful. So we need, and even though it sounds paradox, we need anarchic institutions. We need permanent revolutionary institutions. So we need an architecture as well, and this was my impression today, and that's why I wanted to invite you to go to this building site and have a look. We need architectures that are not stable, that allow like change, and that allow also people to move and fluctuate in a different way. So even though that sounds very abstract, but I think it's these formal rules that need to be changed.
Before we open it completely to the public, there's one question that I have for you, which in your paragraph about our institution, you say that we need new methodologies and new concepts. And you outlined some already, like this idea of openness and adaptability. But what else would you say is needed today?
Well, I mean, to put it, I mean, it's always good for discussion. It's good to be polemic and nasty or like, yeah, polemic, maybe. Or to put it in more aggressive terms, what I observe in contemporary culture is a very big naivete that goes together with what I said before, that everyone thinks that they are victim of the institution, you know. That if only they could do this and that, but then it's the institutions or it's the state or it's the art market and so on that's disturbing them. And my suggestion is rather to actually work with this kind of schizophreny of for example, academic institutions or art institutions that are filled with people that have very good intentions, but are very frustrated because what they want to do is not working. I mean, there's so much like good political intentions, for example, in the art world, and then everything ends up at Art Basel, Miami, or so, you know. But this doesn't happen by accident. So, what my suggestion a bit in the text is to be more self-confident and see what the actual power of institutions are and what the effects of institutions are, even though these effects are not the idealistic, beautiful ones that we would like to have. I mean, we all know that art has a big impact on, it's a big market. We all know it has a big impact on the property market, on gentrification. But we are not capable of using it. You know, so I mean, these are just elements, and it's rather kind of how we should orientate ourselves, where we should look, and where we should start, try to gain traction in a way.
Can we open it to the public and see if anyone has a question or an opinion?
I activated my neighbor.
Okay.
I would like to continue on the topic you've just spoken. What impact the institutions should make instead in our modern age?
It completely depends which institution. I mean, like, I don't know, like...
Mainly I'm speaking about the museum itself, because we're sort of in a museum and I'm mostly familiar with this institution.
I'm really here to learn. So I mean, we were installing here for 3 or 4 days, but like as much as I could, I tried to speak with people who will be part of this institution that is in the making, that is currently rehearsing, you know, and it is rehearsing in public, you know. It's not thinking somewhere in an office and designing a program for 2021, but it's rehearsing and discussing in public. So I would say that is already, that was a challenge, and that was something that I found interesting, and why I was happy to, why I agreed to take part in this experiment, you know. But that is just my little point of view. I'm just a theoretician. So what I'm interested in is how can my position as a philosopher change in this game? Like, why are philosophers always invited to talk about art, you know? So I'm happy if I'm no longer invited to talk about art, but something else. So I don't know what your profession is.
I'm a student and I study art history.
Okay, so then you would have to ask yourself, like, what would you want from a museum that where art historians have a different role, have a different impact. What should it be, you know? Like you're younger, you're from a different generation, you have a different cultural background, so how can you bring yourself in? I can tell you like what I find frustrating and what I'm simply not doing if it's not very well paid, I have to admit. You know, so you see, so it's like I'm the philosopher here, my name is somewhere printed here, so that's, and I have the microphone, I don't give it away. But apart from that, I don't know more than you others, so we should maybe, like in the American 70s films, like these sex parties, you know, and then who has to talk? But I hereby give away the microphone to whoever wants to speak.
Would you like to speak?
Who would like to ask?
I would like to say a sort of a statement. I'm from a theatrical background, from theater, and I think that the institution of the future is the institution of discussion, so the institution of talk. And this is the reason why I'm so interested in the processes which are here right now, because it is all about, discussing and talking around the theme or producing the discourse, let's say. And this is the idea that really inspires me, and it's more important for me than the artwork itself, because it is the, impulse to discuss. And that's why I think it's really fantastic to be a part of it right now.
I just have an idea for you, maybe how to join your talk inside art institution. Maybe you should demand institutions to invite some other people with you, maybe some activists, I don't know, some just maybe by accident, some people who can talk about something, because I don't know, just an idea that institution should consist of people from the different field, from working labor, physical labor, or just intellectual labor, in one group who made decisions together. It is the absence of such kind of conversation. We don't see here people who clean the room, for example, during discussion, yes? And maybe if you invite with you somebody like this, maybe it make fun for everybody.
I just wanted to add, actually, I'm from V-A-C, and what I like very much when Francesco joined our team, that he suggested when we were discussing our plans and how we see the future of Guest 2, what I like very much that he brought to us this perspective when he asked us, could you please just very selfish and egoistic to think, what do you want Guest 2 to be like in 10 years? And I really just started to think, for example, about my son, about my family, what I wanted. And I really think that what is challenge for me, that I was thinking a lot about the majority of institutions, like state institutions in Russia, not only art institutions, but hospitals, schools, and so on, that we, each the time, it's the institution which puts its own time, its own schedule, its own categories, and you need just to implement yourself in this time and in this schedule and in these categories. So now for me, I really see it as an opportunity that that people the city could decide how this institution could and it's really interesting for us because we talk a lot about this idea of institution which changed together with the city, with the citizens, and it's but it's really interesting to find what could be the platform for this dialogue. Should it be the format of such open forums or something else? So it will be interesting to hear opinions, and really it will be interesting to hear just from very selfish point of view what each of us want to see in the center of the Moscow, 1,000 square meters.
In my opinion, I cannot say for all the world, but my world, what I see, that now we have a lot of social networks and a lot of friends there, but in fact I see that it's too hard to people to talk in real life. But the thanks to communities that now a lot around. And this one of the communities, contemporary art, what I see. It's a very big world, very interesting, very different ways of contemporary, of questions which are very sharp now, and a lot of people connected by art. So a lot of discussion by art. So it's a very interesting way to show and connect people, to show the real world now, and to connect people around some questions, some problems. I like that.
Just wanted to say that I really enjoyed when you said that the works were picked out randomly, not randomly, but by chance. So it's an encounter between the text that you wrote and the artwork, and there's no direct thought. Because I have a bachelor in fine arts, and you probably would know that all of us are always tortured to find a concept and explain our work and really dive into this whole why it's like this, why it's like that. And I feel like in a way we lose ourselves trying to justify a work and prove that yes, this image corresponds with this idea and this text. And for me, I would like to think that in the future we'd kind of distance ourselves a bit from it, and because going around the rooms here we feel much more when we don't really look for direct links, like we read the text and then we let our imagination flow, and then different concepts like the concept of Gaia and everything comes up in mind, when you look at the work that you have selected and the text that you wrote. And it's much more freeing rather than having a distinct explanation of everything and having to justify all of it.
Maybe just as a way of summarizing some of the points that came up, like the institution of talk and communities and the involvement of different disciplines. One intention that we are thinking about in designing V-A-C is to find a way of being accountable to our public. So a dream that Teresa Mavica, the director of the foundation, and myself have been talking about for a while is literally how do we set up a parliament for Guest 2, for the new institution that we are designing. So when I was saying earlier that this is a rehearsal, I was pretty serious, as in like, is this the forum that can be, that is the right forum for us to be accountable to members of the community who wants to invest effectively and their own time and their own intelligence and knowledge into an institution that they can take part in, essentially. Is this the right format? And it's interesting because I was discussing with Armin a couple of days ago, and he said, maybe it needs to be digital rather than in person. Maybe there's a way of organizing this feedback mechanism as digital. And I just wanted to throw this in because we are here now, and as a sort of way of meta-reflecting whether this is the best way of having these kind of discussions.
Can I, as a third part, can I finally speak again? Yeah. As a third party, because I hear a dialogue or a discussion between V-A-C and Moscow in my imagination. I'm just visiting, and I thought it's interesting. I want to suggest something that I see a lot of goodwill and openness on the side of the institution. I want to turn around the story. Normally the story is that people complain about the institution. We all know the history. I'm sure you complain about art history departments. I complain about philosophy departments. So everyone, we can go through that. I spare you the details. But actually, let's turn it around. I would suggest, just for the sake of this discussion, institutions are much more advanced. It's us, individuals who are behind. We come in the room and we sit in a conservative way, and the institutions say, "Come on, be more democratic," And then, but we are not. And you said something interesting, Armen. You should demand this and that. And I thought, well, if I go somewhere and say, "Give me a job and a lot of money, and I want to write my books," and no one will take me seriously. But maybe you're right. But that would mean it's not just the duty of the institution to say, to always, how can we build a platform, and should it be digital? No, it should be the audience that should think about, like, what is our demand? What do we want? And how can we institutionalize that? And there the analog or the digital is just a question of like a technology. But the real political act would be like, who is allowed to talk, you know, to quote Rancière. The question is not, do we get 5% or more or less money, but who is allowed to talk? Who is the subject? Who is part of the polis or the demos? Who is speaking? And who can demand something? And I think there's much more, just again to turn it around, there's much more openness on the side of the institution than self-confidence, and that's a political problem on the side of the audience. And I think, hence me as a third party, I'm neutral, you know, I'm not paid for this, I'm paid independent, what I say now. I didn't sign my contract, by the way. But I'm really, let's take this serious for a second, that you should use the opportunity to address what you want and not like wait until someone's asking you, because I know how difficult it is. You cannot around 8 million people in Moscow, like, you know, V-A-C cannot call everyone and say like, do you have any wishes, you know? It's like it should be maybe also the other way around. It was your idea at the beginning, yeah?
Yes, you're right. Now, I would like VC to open a distant, long-term discussion about how institutions should be public, with inviting everybody who wants to participate. So completely open, and I don't know, here maybe in some other places, but everybody can put demand on the table, like, and it should be a long process, I think.
But again, you're asking V-A-C to do something. Do it.
No. Me. I participate in some auto-organized institution. It's my way, but it's not enough.
Okay.
I'm really not so much in this art stuff and contemporary art as well. So I can say only that I can feel now in this discussion. And what I think is that maybe all these institutions are needed to create communication field between people. I think and I believe that art times ago and in ages before was is about the same goal. It's about communication of people. And maybe, I don't know how institutions should look like, but maybe each one of each next institution should be the step to know institutions in our communications. Step by step, we should arrive in that point when we communicate without any institutions. Just as, I don't know how, but somehow from heart to heart with full complexity in a very easy way without any additional actions.
I would just like, I was having a discussion coming here with Armin, and you mentioned this notion of community and the way that a sociologist, right, talks about it in a counterintuitive way. Would you like to just mention it for a second?
It's an Italian philosopher, Roberto Esposito, and he comes up with, I really like that because he talks about communities. And we think about communities as something that where people share something. So these are the Russia fans, or these are the ice hockey fans, or you know, or these are the Aryans, or these are, you know, like, so that's a community where people think that they belong together because they share something, they have something together. And he says, like, etymologically, he has a look at this. The core of the word in community, in communication, in immunity, and that's munus. And what munus means is not, as we would believe, what we share, what we have together, but munus actually means a lack, a gap, something that's missing. So, and from that he develops a political theory, an idea of the community as something an assembly of people that do not share something in common, you know? Of course, it's also an utopian element. And for me, I often use it in my work as a methodology for like how to communicate with each other, you know? Do we communicate by trying to find a common ground? Like, okay, you're an artist, you can't think, but I can think, but maybe we are interested in something in the middle, you know? And then I write about you, and then we find each other. No, I think we should rather like sharpen a bit the conflicts. We should also be aware where we do not understand each other, and not try to become closer and more similar. So that was a bit while we were waiting for a taxi. I didn't know that this is going to become such an abstract. But anyhow, so think about communication based on misunderstanding, of an acknowledgement that we don't understand each other. Because in a way, we seem to like get on very well. No, I'm lucky that I was sitting next to you, because 3 times you said something and you started the communication. On the other hand, we know nothing about each other. Maybe we completely misunderstand each other, you know? So it's also dangerous, but like, what would be an institution that would allow for that? That people come together that don't, you know, that don't pretend everything is fine, you know? Because in the end, we're also very homogeneous. So we would need an institution where not everyone is white, Russian, somehow educated, and needs to say it nearly in an apologetic way that I'm not from the art world, you know? You know, that would also be a challenge, maybe.
I would like to ask one question. When I saw Modigliani piece at the show, it was so terrible, in my opinion, so I even thought it's a fake piece. But the question is, can you imagine that your institution would admit that some of the pieces they were buying or they were showing as an art piece was a mistake? So, and make a revision of collections, or because you know how art market is very much connected to art institutions, and there are a lot of games of big money. So it's obvious that many pieces that are in museums, museum shows, or museum collections are not as good as they are presented to the audience. So how can you imagine that you start talking about this?
I mean, in principle, yes. I'm not sure how many people will be interested in that. As in, I think what you're asking is one element that I find very interesting, which is like admitting institutional failure. And I think for an institution to be able to admit failure is really, really important if the institution is setting itself up to be experimental. Because you do not experiment if you don't put into your own conceptual budget the possibility of failing. So I would say that it's very important that one admits failure. I'm not totally sure that it's always important to admit failure in acquisition policies, because it might be not super interesting for everyone. But I would say that if interrogated, an institution like V-A-C or like Tate or the Pompidou should be able to say, yes, in the 70s we bought this artist and that was a mistake. But in the same time, there's also the element of time, you know. The last 10 years have been years of recuperation of artists from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, who the institution have been putting deep in storage for people not to see, because they were embarrassment of the acquisition committees. And then nowadays there are artists who, you know, maybe the Pompidou or the MoMA bought but then try to forget, which are becoming fashionable again. Or rather than fashionable, meaningful, let's say. So, 2 elements. One is like, how many people would be interested in me saying, you know, yes, 10 years ago we bought this, I don't know, Ettore Sozza's thing, but I think Ettore Sozza is not an interesting artist because he's a designer, and in fact his design is not interesting. While I think it could be interesting to talk about fluctuations of meaning and how things become contemporary, become simultaneous to a time. So one thing that I like a lot is the fact that Marcel Duchamp's large glass was totally forgotten for around 30 years until a generation of artists like Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg brought it back again. So the birth of an artist work, 1917, the large glass, and its impact onto the cultural scene might be separated. So, sorry, I'm giving you a very complex and abstract question, but it's like, one is like, who would be interested in that admission of failure of acquisition policy, how that failure might actually turn around again in 20 years, are the two answers to your question, but I took your question to say, admitting failure is fundamental if you want to be experimental.
Yes, because this question also means that today possibly we were standing in the room near the piece talking about philosophy, and maybe in the future some new intellectual generation will say it was totally fake practice. So that's...
Completely. And when I said at the beginning, this is a rehearsal, this is an experiment, in 15 minutes we'll have to close down, and some of you might come to me and say, like, that was stupid, because it was not meaningful. And I'll try again another way. But that's what it means to experiment, is like to put yourself, expose yourself to failure until you get to the point of getting
Can I have
meaningful.
another, like, maybe weird question in this context? We're talking about the museum, and sorry, I'm trying to make you unemployed, but maybe art institutions of the future are not, I mean, the art is not that relevant, you know, this acquisition or the other, you know, like art institution and the impact they have on society is not really depending on whether there's a Modigliani or two Damien Hirsts. That is not the function, that is not the real effect of the Tate modern, and that is not the real effect of the Centre Pompidou or the V-A-C or the MoMA here. I mean, it's a provocative question, but like for me, the art field is very interesting. These discussions are interesting, the political debates are interesting, but like the artworks, sorry for that, might not have this relevance in the future. And we are just, it's just a kind of like old-fashioned habit that we think of the art world as, okay, if we want to think about the art world, we got to think about the artworks that the museums show. But maybe the art institutions of the future will do that like nearby, you know, but not primarily.
But could I interact? Why an artwork? Yeah, surely. Why an artwork should be relevant and what we display in museums should be relevant? Because to me, an artwork is a representation of its time, and it's a source of knowledge. Because as a scholar, I'm mainly interested in what this artwork says to me.
It was meant as a provocation, not an insult. I would say, like, well, you got to change your scholarship-ishness. You know, maybe these historical questions become less and less relevant. It's just as a kind of answer to the Modigliani detail debate, which I'm sure it's very interesting. But I just wanted to throw it in that what would be a discussion about art institutions without discussion about art? Like maybe we should bracket the art question for 5 years. Maybe that would do us all good. I don't know. Is the V-A-C going to become a museum with a permanent collection? I do not even know whether that's the plan. You know, but it's just, you know, I try to bring in a kind of irritation. Like, what are we even like talking about? Maybe we should ask ourselves maybe not the V-A-C has to think about how to make things democratic, but the Demos should rather do that. And maybe we should not think so much about the collection. You know, maybe that's all nonsense, but you might go home and if this is an experiment, that also means you make an experience. So what experience are you going to take home? Some knowledge about Modigliani or the definition of institution, or next time I sit down differently. You know, maybe that's the experience.
That's something very close to me.
I just wanted to say that I think when we're talking about art, we somehow we forget that it is, for me at least, quite a political question, how we take into consideration opinion of many people who cannot, as you pointed out, like make this opinion heard. So how do we do so that everyone is pleased and happy, and not consider an institution as like a somehow dictatorship organization in many ways. So I thought that for me maybe it is okay to acknowledge the distance that is between the institution and the people, and the attempt to be like as more close to like a regular person. Maybe it's not the only option. Maybe we should acknowledge this distance, but it can be measured not in privileges like it used to be, like in 19th century and in 20th century, and still it is like this, but in some other things, like there is still the different level of finance that can an institution afford and a person, right? So maybe it's okay that there is this distance, but maybe we should reconsider why we are so different. So the first things that comes to mind, of course, is the level of expertise that the institution has, and the level of finance and connections in the, like now we're in the art institution, so it's in the art world, but maybe there is something to look further into.
I have nothing to answer that, because I believe in a distance too, especially when we are in such a huge community and an institution.
A huge what?
A huge institution.
Maybe it's because I'm exhausted, but I don't have any answers. I just contradict from now on. I mean, we're coming to the end. I mean, I suggest that we rather see institution as not as the other, you know? What I tried to say at the beginning is the institutions are in our head. We know how to behave because institutions told us where to sit down, you know? And there are institutions that say, no, sit down like in a democratic way, but we sit down in the non-democratic way, you know? So we cannot blame the institutions. The real question is like, how do we transform them? And we can only transform them if we leave this kind of naive, romantic idea of us, we're actually good, but institutions with all this money, you know, they're evil and they're not listening to us. I think we have to get rid of that, of this kind of good and bad, the individual versus the other. We are only individualized by institutions, by the religions, by the countries we are, by the schools we go to, by the art academies that tell us how to sit down when a speaker comes whose name is projected, and so on, you know? So, so it's much more of a political question for all of us, you know? And not something to complain about that the institutions are not doing it. Again, institutions are not just the V-A-C, the MoMA, but to just repeat myself, marriage and trade unions and the market and schools and openings are like institutions, you know, it's institutional forms. They shape our behavior, our patterns of behavior by sanctions and rewards. We know if we behave in a certain way, we get good rewards, or we get like sanctions. We are kicked out because if there's a panel in a traditional way, and we sit down where the microphone is, and don't let the speaker speak, I mean, there's going to be sanctions. We're kicked out, you know. So It's very simple, and we can only change it together.
But how new transform institution can be a force for good for everyone?
I mean, the reason why what we're rehearsing here is that not me, but there is an institution who is willing to do something, and you should rather interact with the institution, not with me. Like whatever ideas you have, like demand it, you know, or like institutionalize yourself. So once the, you know, I don't know where you're going afterwards, but go there with or without the V-A-C people and come up with a plan, and then communicate it to them. You know where to find them, you know. So that's my suggestion, because unfortunately I'm flying tomorrow.
Actually, as for me, I'm not from art background. I'm coming from business background, and every time I come to a museum, and a contemporary art museum, I feel like I'm entering the complete misunderstanding, like society and everything else. That's why I was just addressing the previous story about like misunderstanding institution. And as for me, it's about like my feelings. A really great thing when you meet contemporary art is that it's not reflecting your real life, especially when you're coming from business and like day-to-day routine background. Every time you meet contemporary art, you love the idea of misunderstanding. And that's what I suppose should be still in the future institution of art if we're talking about like cultural institutions.
To follow up on the comment, I think it was Armen who said it. And it was about that many institutions are trying to to be democratic and to involve the audience, while the audience often is not very willing to be involved and to interact. And I think one way around this could be introducing some games, maybe theatrical games or some sort of social choreography, some games which will be quite simple to play for the audience, but might be like a sort of the bottle game, but maybe a little bit more intrinsical. So like the games with interesting, and they should be tailored for each, probably for each specific exhibition, if we are talking about art institutions. And then also thinking about what I would want from institutions, not just art institutions. One problem for me is that many institutions, they look very similar. I mean, they feel very similar. And I would want them to be more differentiated. And instead of, I think, maybe trying to organize an institution for everyone, it could be a good idea to make these institutions like more exclusive, like institutions for very small groups of people, like united around one topic, maybe one artwork, like about united around large glass and green book, or united around one novel or one person. And I think in this sort of institutions, like exclusive institutions, it will be easier to invent these games that will help to involve the audience, because they will be already like a sort of united by one interest, very specific one.
Hi, I'm a part of the Faculty of Mediation, and one day we were discussing what we would like to see in the institution or in the city, just in particular, what kind of place we would like to see and to have in Moscow. And the only thing that came in my mind was the place where nothing is happening. The place where you're not obligated to participate or you're not obligated to do something. It's just the place that you can just come into and feel, kind of free from the activities that our institutions and restaurants and everything is trying to involve you to. And so I was just thinking about the thing that the institutions should involve people and the audience into doing something. And well, the problem is that every time when I leave my house, I feel like I'm obligated to participate, and everything is trying to involve me somewhere into some activities or something. And well, in the big city as Moscow it's very overwhelming, and sometimes you're feeling very tired just of this participatory thing. And even though I think that it's a huge step forward from something that we were having before, I was thinking that maybe the institution of the future could be just a field where you can just don't do anything, where the institution isn't telling you what you can do in the positive way, what you can discuss in the positive way, just to change something, but just to have a place where you can just breathe and just feel free from all this noise that this city is giving you. And the thing is, maybe I thinking was it's the most liberal way to build an institution where you're not obligated to do something and where you're not given the activities, and maybe it's the utopia, but I was thinking that maybe that's the ultimate place where you can experience where there's no noise around.
If I just quickly say something about this, the kind of invitation that we would like to make with like this setting and rehearsal that I'm talking about is not necessarily participation. I mean, there's this interesting definition of the ladder of participation, which goes up more and more ability to influence a situation from do you want to enter this exhibition, yes or no, or do you want this artwork to be red or blue, into do you want an exhibition to take place, into finally what exhibition do you want to see. And I think in this ladder, on the one side there is participation as like a binary option, and on the other side there is what I would like to propose, which is like, how do you get up to owning that institution? And how do you tell the institution what to do? That's what Armin was saying earlier. Rather than an institution obliges you to participate, so tells you what to do. So it's the reversal of that. So what you're saying now is like, maybe we need silence. And it's like, okay, how do we create a forum for V-A-C to be able to hear what you're asking is what I'm interested in. So I'm not interested in you participating in any sort of pre-designed setup. I'm interested in us having the ability to hear the voice of the citizens of Moscow, because we want to do an institution that is for this city, not an institution that could be in Dubai or in Zurich and just does what the perfect international museum does. It's much more interesting to find a way in which the institution is owned by the people who go into the institution.
Сам вопрос об институции.
Actually, the notion of institution, the very concept, implies that quite a lot of people found it possible to get self-organized, to get synchronized in the way they think. If we consider the history of art, we will see at all times that the avant-garde artistic movements are never, ever approved by any institutions. At the same time, the foundations like Victoria Foundation claim to be doing exactly this. That is, well, no, actually, I'm not saying the institutions can do this, because the artists have some kind of sensitivity. They have a sensitivity to perceive the reality sometime in advance before we learn how to actually articulate it. And I am just thinking this exhibition no longer corresponds to the actual spirit of time. It's somehow outdated. It's somehow behind. I do not at all understand how we can discuss this, because our today's forum is not at all a unique event. I mean, all the institutions in the world are doing this kind of thing. I just see how the themes, the discussions are like a real copy-paste of things. I mean, the mediators are doing the same thing in the Garage Center for Contemporary Art. A couple of years ago, we had these mediators all over the place. I mean, I'm not sure I'm formulating it well enough, but, you know, I just have this feeling that you're not developing culture, you are impeding its development, you're stalling it. Aren't you afraid of that? Because by demonstrating some particular type of art, you targets the future artists that are just learning to become artists to do this kind of art because they want to be working with institutions. Now, when they grow up and start speaking this language, they will be told, well, no, you're no longer relevant, you are outdated. So it might be impossible to overcome this gap between the practice and the time when we are mature enough to theorize this. Because in my thinking, theory is always somehow behind practice, although the institutions will present it in a somewhat different fashion. I don't know if you understand me, though.
I disagree. I mean, you know, the question is from what point of view are you talking? You know, I really think it's a naive approach to say like, I'm wondering like, what's the Russian thing? That's me. First comes the practice, first comes the artist, then the theories behind, and the institutions are always trying to musealize the good artist. It's a very romantic understanding of art. It's also a very romantic understanding of politics. And it's a very traditional, and to be even more provoking in a positive way, it's a very Western idea of like progress. You know, time is linear, time is like going in this direction, and there's always something needs to be before or behind. In your case, it's practice, then you're blaming institutions to do the other thing, that the theory comes first. And I would say like we have to get rid of this linear model of time. No, I'm not, I don't want to get into philosophical discussion, I just want to say, what if the whole distinction between theory and practice doesn't make sense? What if, and that would be my approach, to say like theory is a practice. We can do it this way, we can do it in another way, and I agree with you, it's not the first time that people sit around and try to talk to each other. Me personally, I don't know any institution that is in the moment of constructing something. And while it's doing that, it tries to be in touch with an audience to imply this information into the projection of the institution in the making. I mean, that is something very unique. I can say that because I don't have to defend an institution I'm not part of, you know. But I disagree, and not in order to say you're wrong, but just in order to see like, okay, of course one can see certain elements of what you see are correct, but does it really help us? Is that really still like the best way to analyze our situation? The good artist, the bad institution, you know, the good practitioner and the theory coming behind. I'm not sure it will help us in the 21st century.
Actually, my artist practice is to avoid linear timeline. So what I suggest as an artist is like all time exists in one. So, and when it's a little bit of conflict in what you say, because when we are imagining future institution, it's automatically means the linear time. So we don't say that we should return. Maybe we also can say, let's return to the classical museum. Yes, you don't suggest it.
I mean, you might do this in your art, but in your discourse, you know, you're repeating this kind of like avant-garde model. So, but what we should do is not talk about it. Next time I come to Moscow, we should like spend some time and actually work on this. And got to find out like how we work on it. And it won't be by me looking at your art and judging it, or by us talking for another hour on the topic of the theory of time and practice of time. You know, so that would be something we should ask the institution. Do you, institution, give us the possibility to work on this in a different way than having an argument with words, where we talk about words are not so relevant because the practice is more important than the words, always contradicting ourselves. You see what I mean?
Yes, can I ask another question? One short.
There's a danger of me disagreeing again.
So you were talking about human, post-human, transhuman in the room. and you were saying like who we are, if we are human or not, but for me it's obvious that we are human living in a presence. So, and all other questions are too metaphorical. So I know you're a philosopher, you have to ask this kind of question. So what you're a philosopher and who you think you are? Are you a human?
It's not me, a philosopher, who comes up with this idea of post-human and transhuman. It's the people that are actually producing the future you will live in Silicon Valley, in technology companies and so on, that philosophize about the post-human, about the transhuman. It's not a philosophical idea, you know.
Do you ask this question to you as a person?
What, me as a person?
Do you think you are human? If you ask this question, I want to ask it seriously, because it's always like metaphorical.
It's not metaphorical. The question is like, what is human, you know? Do we understand the human as the opposite of the non-human, as opposite of plants, as opposite of animals, as opposite of I don't know what? Is that the right way to ask it in the 21st century? So that was a bit my point. But now we're drifting away from the. We should do.
I suggest that maybe we continue the conversation over the drink, because I think
2 drinks.
People are thirsty. But while closing down, please do carry on discussing and come and ask us questions. It can carry on being an open forum, and I'd like to thank very much Armen for accepting the invitation and accepting the provocation, tripling it and turning up the volume of provocation to help us think in a different way. Thank you very much.